This amazing airplane rapidly became a legend in its design, development, and combat record. It's Japan's famous World War II fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M5. Most Japanese fighter aces flew this aircraft in combat, from the air war in China to the attack on Pearl Harbor and on to the very end, when it was used as a kamikaze plane. Designed by Hiro Hirikoshi, the 34-year-old chief design engineer at Mitsubishi, the Zero fighter was first reported to a disbelieving U.S. War Department by Claire Chennault. He was the head of the American volunteer group better known as the Flying Tigers. Chennault described this new ultra-secret Japanese fighter as having a top speed of 322 miles an hour, a range of 1,100 miles, plus a half hour at full combat ability with a droppable fuel tank. It could climb to 16,000 feet in 6 minutes and was armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. By December 1st, 1941, Japan had 444 Zero fighters. The Western world had no idea that the decks of Japan's 6 largest carriers were lined with these new weapons of war, and that they were on their way to strike Pearl Harbor. Hi, I'm Steve Hinton, and welcome to another Roaring Glory Warbird program, featuring one of the all-time most famous fighters of World War II, the Japanese Zero. This ASIC Japanese designers sacrificed armament to achieve their competitive edge in climb, maneuverability, and roll rate, which left the Zero fighter pilot with little protection. Western pilots quickly discovered that a quick burst of firepower from their machine guns could instantly turn the Zero into a ball of fire. In June of 1944, this particular Zero fighter was captured on Saipan Island. It was brought back to the U.S. for military flight testing to study and discover the innermost secrets of the Japanese engineering ingenuity. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was one of the test pilots who flew this airplane. He signed this log as a representative of the United Aircraft Corporation. This log reads like a who's who of American pilots. What did they discover about this top secret enemy fighter? We'll find out when we go flying in the Zero fighter. In the early days of the Pacific War, this amazing fighter had the British and the American pilots puzzled. The Zero fighter weighed in at about half of what our fighters did, and its remarkable lightweight design allowed it to outmaneuver the P-40 and all of the other early American and Brit fighters. Let's look at some of the interesting features of the A6M5 Zero. The landing gear you can see is of standard construction, the oleo strut, wheel brakes. This is a striker pad during the gear retraction. As the landing gear retracts, comes up here and hits the striker pad, closes the clamshell door. You can see how simple that design is. Looking up in here, you see the uplock, and as the gear retracts, the uplock comes and hangs on this hook, and that holds the gear retracted when the gear is up. See the unique yellow leading edges of the Japanese fighters. This was to help identify the fighters when they head-on view. The ground personnel could identify their own type as they came on head-on. This is a landing gear indicator. As the gear retracts up into the well, this goes into the wing so the pilot can look out and tell the position of his landing gear. The structure is very simple and lightweight, as you can see. All the locking mechanism is located up inside this area for the downlock of the gear. An interesting thing about that was the downlock assembly is an exact copy of a Douglas SBD type retract mechanism, and as we understand it, it was bought under license prior to World War II and copied, and it works very well, well engineered. We come up to the front, we see the original Sakai 31 engine. It's a 14-cylinder, 1,700 cubic inch supercharged 2-row radial engine. Hamilton standard propeller design, constant speed operating, counterweighted propeller. And an interesting part of that, the propeller design was purchased under license prior to World War II from Hamilton Standard. And some parts used in this propeller were even shelf items that we were able to purchase from Hamilton Standard themselves. So, I mean, that's how closely intermixed the parts were anyway. As we walk around this side, you can see the oil cooler inlet. And the oil cooler temperature is controlled by regulating the amount of air that goes through it. And there's some shutters on the back of the oil cooler. The pilot has a little crank, can close the shutters off and raise the oil temperature, or open them and let more air through. Same with the cowl flaps. Has a a crank operation in the cockpit, and the cowl flaps can be opened and closed as desired to maintain the cylinder head temperature. The A6M5 incorporated jet-type exhaust stacks, which gave additional thrust to the airplane, and it helped this airplane attain a top speed of over 350 miles an hour. The armament on the A6M5 Zero fighter consisted of 2 machine guns located in the cockpit that shot through the cowling, through the propeller, and a cannon on each wing. As we look under the wing of the Zero fighter, we can see the aluminum structure, and you might notice these wing spars. And the Zero was the first aircraft that was credited with using the high-strength, lightweight duraluminum. Another interesting thing about the Zero fighter, the ailerons on the airplane. They're very light, very maneuverable airplane, and lightness is due to the fact that they're a freeze design. As you can see, they're aerodynamically balanced. High rate of roll. Look at the deflection of the aileron. And also the fact that the aileron goes up further than it goes down, aids in controlling the yaw of the airplane during a rolling maneuver. And behind this inspection panel is the hydraulic reservoir, which holds the fluid required to operate the landing gear and the wing flaps. And as we look at the tail of the Zero fighter, we can see it's of conventional design. Large vertical stabilizer aiding in the stability of the aircraft. We have fabric covered control surfaces, metal trim tabs, fully retracting tail wheel, solid rubber tail wheel tire. The aircraft is basically very similar to the other aircraft that we're used to looking at in the Roaring Glory Warbird stories. The Zero was also the first Japanese aircraft to incorporate a fully enclosed cockpit. As we sit down in the Japanese Zero cockpit, we realize how small it really is. The cockpit was built for a very small person, so we've had to do some changes so a 6-foot pilot can fly the airplane. Anyway, as we sit here and we look down on our left, there's some controls in here that are still left, that are not operable, but are left in here for historic reasons. Like these 2 T-handles back here were the fire bottles, CO2 cartridges you could pull. Because of the problems that the Zeros had, as you well note the history books talk about, of how they were easily shot down because they caught fire. Well, there was a fire suppressant system with CO2 that shot CO2 around the fuel cell areas and around the engine compartment. So these are the T-handles for them. But this is the elevator trim indicator. This is the rudder trim, and you know your position by actually just visually looking at the chain, seeing how much rudder you use. Down here we're located as a fuel selector. We've simplified the system on this airplane. We just have a left tank to select and a right tank to select. So we've got 65 gallons of fuel in each side. So we're 130 gallon total. Interesting thing about a Zero, because it's such a low wing loading, lightweight aircraft, and the airplane was capable of flying at really low power settings, and because of that, this airplane had a great range with a belly tank on it. This airplane was reported to have a range of over 1,000 miles, 1,300 nautical miles, and this presented quite a interesting scenario here at the start of the war. The Japanese Zero was seen all over the Pacific, which led our intelligence reports to believe that there were Japanese airfields everywhere, when in essence these airplanes were flying 600 miles from home sometimes, and were reported seen around various installations all around the South Pacific. So that was another reason the Zero had such a mystique followed it around. Throttle quadrant, and this was a combat thing. This is how you fired the guns. We had a position for guns and cannons, or we could select guns only. It's cute, huh? Throttle. This is the mixture control and the propeller RPM control. That pretty much takes care of the left side of the cockpit, and as we look at the instrument panel, it's rather an unusual layout by today's comparison, but we've got our flight instruments on the left, engine instruments on the right. You can see some of the changes we've made. We put an American altimeter, American airspeed indicator, mag switch. This is our nav indicator. In the center we put their electric fuel pump engine primer and starter controls in the middle. And up top, the replica machine guns with the levers here where the pilot could operate them to, you know, cock the breeches on the machine guns. Ammo was carried behind the instrument panel in these big elaborate ammo trays. It was very complicated to work on this thing, so that's all been removed. We have a communication radio in front of us, compass. Interesting thing here, Sea Fury pedals are one of the modifications we made from the original Zero. The original Japanese rudder pedal were a pair of pedals mounted on a rod, if you could visualize. So as you move the rudders, the pedals, if you, let's say, went to full right rudder, you couldn't hardly push on the brake. So we were able to find a set of rudder pedals that would fit in here off of a Hawker Sea Fury. And the British designed their pedals so that the foot peg is always at you. So we're still rotating a pole, but the pedals hinge, and they're always able, your foot is always able to find the brake wherever the rudder pedal is. So it's just for safety and reliability is why we did that. And on the control stick, you can see this where the stick mounts and the control movement. There's plenty of room in the cockpit. It clears everything nicely. And continuing on the right side, we have our engine instruments, and we've upgraded them with American instruments. You can see our engine instruments here. We have our manifold pressure, and its markings are range marked to simulate the Japanese instrument. In reality, our red line is 37 inches for takeoff maximum. So this is just there for kind of looks. Fuel pressure, engine RPM, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, oil temperature. This is the shutter for the oil cooler, regulating the air that goes through it. There's our indicator. This is the cowl flap, manual control on the cowl flap. Just crank and we just look over the top and see where they are. But that's really the cockpit. Once you understand it and realize its historical value and, you know, kind of why things are where they are, it really does make sense. And from a pilot standpoint, from my seat, you know, it adds to the thrill of sitting in such an important piece of history, you know. And this airplane being a significant plane as it was, it's really special for me to just sit here and admire. Even everything as out of place as it might seem. It's really great. Clear. Fuel pressure winding up to 22 psi. Okay, landing gear handles down, flap handles up, and we're ready to go. A couple shots of prime, and I've already cranked it through, but I'll go through 9. There's 4 blades, 5, 6, 7, 8. Conventional feel of any of the other round engines. It's got a really nice 114-cylinder, 1,700 cubic inch Sakai 31, and they were water injected up to 1,200 horsepower. We don't see 900 horsepower with it though for takeoff as much as we'll ever run with it. That's just for longevity reasons. So the cockpit's laid out in conventional standard, similar to the other airplanes of its era. An unusual aspect of this airplane is the landing gear flap handles on the right side. So, in other words, for takeoff, you've got to take your hand off the throttle, put your hand on the stick, take your right hand off the stick, put it on the landing gear, and retract the handle. So it's a little awkward. Gear retraction is about 6-7 seconds up. 2 or 3 seconds down. Gravity helps a lot. But the cowl flaps are manually operated with a crank handle, and they're wide open for all operations on the ground. Trail to take off, trail to climb, regardless of what the cylinder temperatures are. And the oil cooler door, oil temperature takes a long time to warm up on this airplane, so we've got the shutters all the way shut. Now we're just going to go up through the warm-up cycle here, which is nothing more than not operating the engine over about 1,000 RPM until our oil temperature is at least 40 degrees centigrade. And we're about 25 right now, so we've got another couple minutes to go here. In the meantime, you know, for pre-takeoff, controls free and easy, full movement. Fuel selector is on our fullest tank. In this case, when the airplane is full of fuel, we'll use the left left tank for takeoff. Otherwise, just the fullest tank. That's where our vapor vent return goes from the carburetor. And our fuel load right now, we got 60 gallons of fuel in the right tank, and we have 40 gallons of fuel in the left tank. The engine consumes anywhere from 50 gallons an hour down to about 20 gallons an hour, but just a normal cruise on this engine to indicate a 175, 180 knots, a normal cruise about 40 gallons an hour. Pretty economical rating measure really for this kind of airplane. Okay, oil temperature is up to 40, so we'll take the pop up to 1,700 RPM, and we're going to cycle the RPM. Checking the constant speed or pitch control of the propeller. Watching the oil pressure. We'll run it through 3 cycles. And from 1,700, take it down to about 1,400, back up again. That looks pretty good. Check our voltmeter, it's showing a good charge. And we'll push up 2,000 RPM, check the mag. Left and right mag, check good, about a 50 drop, oil pressure is good. We're pretty good. I'm just going to open the oil cooler a little bit, go to tower frequency.
641 Romeo is number 1. 7041 Romeo, Roger, 126 right, thanks, in the position hold. 41 Romeo, position hold.
And Chino Mitsubishi 770 is ready to go in sequence.
46770, Chino Tower, 126 right, thanks, in position hold.
Okay, boost pump is on, cowl flaps are set to trail. We're going to line it up, lock the tail wheel, and advance the throttle at 35 inches. Switch hands, put the gear up, and then back to 30 inches at 24. The public was told that the Zero was merely an imitation of a half a dozen U.S. and one British design. But facts prove that this highly original fighter was the result of numerous years of ingenious Japanese research and trials. The Zero has very smooth and balanced controls, elevator, aileron, and rudder. They're very smooth and very direct, you might say. It isn't until you get going over 200 knots the ailerons begin to become very heavy. And the rate of roll of the Zero is very fast. It's half again as fast as the Hellcat or some of its contemporary fighters from World War II. This is the Sockeye 31, 1,705 cubic inches, 14-cylinder, supercharged, two-row radial power plant. Much of the Zero's success as a fighter was due to the Sockeye engine. This outstanding power plant was used in other Japanese planes, including the Japanese Imperial Navy's Nakajima D5N2 Kate, and in the Army, the Ki-43 Oscar fighter. These Japanese planes were both very prominent throughout the Pacific War, but it was the Zero fighter that brought the greatest recognition to the Sockeye engine. The Air Museum Planes of Fame spent 5 years restoring the Zero into flyable condition, and of the 15,000 built in World War II, this is the only remaining fully original Zero left flying. And virtually almost all the parts from the original aircraft are used in this restoration, including the Sockeye engine. If one singular plane ever represented the strength of a nation's air power, it was the Japanese Zero fighter. This amazing machine was so superior that it gave the Japanese military leadership enough confidence to attack the United States, plunging Japan into a war covering nearly the entire Pacific Ocean. This airplane was far superior to any other in service, or on the drawing board when it first appeared. The Zero fighter earned its special place in world history. This machine is a lasting tribute to the creative ideas and designs of Hiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi. Today, with our Japanese allies working alongside us to uncover and develop new technological ways of improving our lives, we all benefit from that Japanese tradition of superior engineering and design excellence. Join me next time and we'll go fly another Roaring Glory Warbird. Today we're going to take you along to experience the exciting true adventures of the Japanese Navy ace fighter pilot, Mike Kawato. He entered service in World War II at the tender age of 18, and during his combat career in the South Pacific, this young pilot downed 19 enemy aircraft, including the F-4U Corsair flown by none other than America's Marine ace fighter pilot, Pappy Boynton. After the war was over, these two rival pilots would become buddies. But during those daring dogfights over Rabaul and the Solomon Islands, Mike Kawato's A6M5 would be shot down 5 times, and he'd face seemingly impossible odds to survive. Welcome to another episode of The Young Pilots. Mike was the youngest pilot in his squad. He looked like a kid of only 15 or 16. This would cause the commanding staff to sometimes joke at such a child's hope to fight a man's air war. But they soon realized that this unique young man's energy and skill would very likely turn him into an ace pilot. That is, if he lived long enough. No American or British aircraft could match the speed and turn rate of the Japanese Zero at the beginning of World War II. But by 1943, competition for victory in the sky had grown. The United States Marines had finally taken delivery of their new Chance Vought F-4U Corsairs, and the American naval fleet had added a new superpowered bird designed by Grumman, the F-6F Hellcat. So young pilot Mike Kawato was now taking off to face an enemy armed with fighters that would soon turn the tide of the air war over the Pacific and set the course of world history. It was early in September of 1943 when 18-year-old Mike Kawato finally completed his training in Japan. Immediately, this young pilot and 42 of his classmates were ordered to the Takashima military base at Truk Island in the South Pacific.
I had been dreaming of this moment my whole life. Here I was, actually sitting in the cockpit of one of 200 brand new Zeros, about to take off for an adventure I had created ever since I was just a boy of 9 years. When I was in grade school, all of my friends loved to play war games. We were taught that Japan was a superior military power because of our long tradition of ancient samurai. Those great and fearless warriors who fought to the death for the honor of Japan's victory. Our religion also told us that if we died in battle for our homeland, we would be assured of a special place in heaven, along with all those great warriors of yesteryear. We were told this as children by everyone we trusted, our teachers, the government, even our own parents, who of course loved us deeply and secretly prayed to God that we would never be called upon to die in war, but instead live in peace, to have children of our own, kids who would never need to live in such a world where violence and death would get you into heaven. So you could say that our parents, in their hearts, were just like every other family. Japanese, German, American, British. No mom or dad wanted their boys to become warriors. In 1941, at the age of 16, I volunteered as junior student in pilot training school, thinking it would be a shortcut to my dream of flying a plane. During the month of May, I was assigned to the Maizuru Marine Unit, where my initial ground training started. This training consisted of general education, military drills, basic piloting, and physical training. The physical training included kendo, judo, fencing, and gymnastics. It was very rigorous in order to discipline our bodies and minds. General maintenance of airplanes was also included. During a 6-month period, we learned to tear down and reassemble a radial engine. After finishing ground training, we were transferred to Yativi Base, located north of Suchiura. And in October of that same year, 1941, we began actual flight training. Those of us who had made it to this level of training were called Number 11 Air Trainees, or Hiran in Japanese. We began with taking off and landing exercises, combined with basic aeronautic maneuvers. This was the part of training I loved the most, flying. Some older students made fun of the 2-seat Mitsubishi trainer aircraft. They wanted to fly only a sleek, super-powered fighter. But I loved all airplanes. I believed that any aircraft design was a miracle to behold. After all, it can enable a man to fly, right? Besides, the Mitsubishi company was the same one who designed and built the greatest fighter of all, the Zero. The Hiran training program was the toughest in the world. I don't think anyone older than we were could take it. We were awakened at 4:30 every morning. Our training was completely different from that of the US. First of all, we started with takeoffs and landings. Whoever was lucky enough was allowed to take a mid-air flight lesson. My instructor's name was First Sergeant Major Susumi Itao. He taught me takeoffs, landings, stalls, formation, intermediate navigation, aerobatics, night takeoffs, and night flights. With his encouragement and discipline, I logged 100 hours of flying time. My teacher often let me solo, but at first I didn't do very well in aerial training, so he scolded me severely. After graduation in May of 1942, we were sent to Izumi Air Base, where we were assigned to various types of planes according to our individual skills and overall grades. 20% of my class were granted their choice of any type of plane. I chose to be a fighter pilot because it would be rich in thrills and I could make my own decisions. I was now 17 years old. I went through 70 hours of rigid training, including combat, 1 against 1. My favorite training of all was man-to-man dogfights. There was no instructor who could beat me. We also had target practice with live shells. These were targets towed behind the plane. And in order to increase my score, I once got too close. The bullet grazed the wing of the plane, pulling the target. I got hell for that. But now, this was the real thing. I was about to fly into battle with my machine guns fully loaded for action. The Japanese Navy had a carrier anchored off a truck with its flight deck full of Zeros. Certain strategies were planned for the Solomon and Warbirds Islands. Japan was now on the defensive in the war. Many of our new fighters had not even gone through flight testing yet. Word had spread that many pilots would probably not live more than 2 weeks. I tried not to pay attention to those veterans who marked that Rabu battle area was a graveyard for the new pilots. After takeoff, we fell into tight formation for our 1.5-hour flight to the battlefront. I was assigned to one of 3 flight groups, Squadron 253. My best friend was 17, just like me. We had been together since our very first day of training at Missouri. Tomorrow was his birthday. Last night, he made a vow to shoot down an enemy fighter before he turned 18. My friend was flying the third plane next to me. He kept looking over at me, smiling, and giving me the thumbs up sign. We had been warned to be silent during the entire mission and not to use our radios under any circumstances, so that enemy patrols in the area would not hear us chattering and hone in for a surprise attack. We also were cautioned that we should expect the possibility of meeting the enemy while on our way to the front. That is exactly what my friend and I hoped for, a dogfight, one-on-one. There were no enemy planes anywhere. Our flight was quiet, peaceful, and serene. Too boring for a couple of over-anxious teenagers who were tired of training exercises and practice missions, and instead wanted to taste the thrill of some real action. An hour passed, flying over the endless blue ocean and through the white cotton-like clouds so typical of South Seas. I noticed that my friend's plane had started to sway a little from side to side. I did not pay much attention at first, but when it started to suddenly dive toward the first plane, I tried to wave to him, to warn him, but I was too late. In a split second, his reserve tank was struck by another plane's propeller, and half his tank tore away. I was the last one to return to the base. Don't ever break information, not even a dogfight. How many lives do you expect to have? These were reprimands I got from Commander Akamoto and First Petty Officer Tanaka. The Allied forces increased their strength and pierced our defense of the Solomon Islands. We were short on staff, and I was assigned to communication duty. Around 9:30 a.m., we heard a loud noise from the south. I ran out of the command post and saw a North American B-25 coming at us, skimming over the palms. This was a brave attack. It seemed like an endless line of planes. Enemy planes bore down upon us so low that it appeared as if they were skimming over the surface of the sea and the mountains. When the advance group was above the base, they dropped their bombs, as if scattering beans. Good grief. I found myself running toward a zero and encountered two ground crewmen under the wing in utter confusion. It was probably their first air raid. Engine finally started. The tail end of the enemy advance group was passing over the north side of the base, and I could see a large formation of enemy planes approaching from the south. I took off toward the B-25s, opening up my machine gun full blast. Through the jungle. It was impossible to climb since I was completely covered by the enemy. I came out of the jungle over the ocean. Holding an altitude of 20 meters, I saw a powerful force of approximately 70 B-25s. I brought my plane up, took after the P-38, which was ahead of the group in a reconnaissance position. As I was pursuing the enemy's commander's plane, I was forced to descend to 10 meters above the sea. There was no way to escape. I was trapped. There were planes above, at my sides, in front, and behind me. A group of B-25s were flying approximately 10 meters higher than me. There was no other choice but to attack from the front and below. I had all 4 machine guns in full blast. Perhaps it was only about 2 or 3 seconds contact, but it seemed like eternity to me. To my right, one of the B-25s caught fire, and at the same time a few bullets hit the fuselage of my plane. Flames burst out from my left wing. Suddenly, I made up my mind to ditch. My engine was hit and oil was splashing against the windshield. Oh, the hell with it. I'll try to fly underneath him. My body spun once or twice in the air. I was sucked into the unknown. I felt a choking sensation. There was a jerk. I was lifted up. The parachute had opened. October 15th, a large enemy convoy was approaching. We were to attack this fleet at early daybreak. The weather was cloudy, but we were able to spot the enemy fleet. Then we spotted the convoy air cover. A fierce air battle ensued. The enemy held an advantageous position, and it was a tough fight for us. However, in time we were able to regroup because of Commando Akamoto's skillful maneuvering. Akamoto carried the air battle in such skillful manner that even while fighting, we maintained our objective direction, home base. The enemy air attacks increased and were of fierce nature. Attacks came 5 times daily. Our arriving transport fleet needed cover, and we found ourselves constantly on the move, fighting, counterfighting, and escorting. The jungle surrounding us was shaken by the bombing and strafing. Harassment raids continued, day after day. An enemy force of about 40 planes was heading toward Rabaul. We took off at 7:30 a.m. There was no way of knowing what altitude the enemy was flying at, so we grouped them into 3 units of 10 planes each, holding an altitude of 3,000, 5,000, and 7,000 meters each. I saw a strange sight. An F-4U Corsair was after a Zero. Suddenly, the first Zero burst into flames and went down. I kept my cool and waited until I had the right distance. After 15 or 16 rounds, the F-4U started to smoke a little, but no flames. Suddenly, his canopy opened, and I saw a figure jump out. I stopped chasing him and brought my plane up, watching the F-4U go down, skimming the surface of the ocean. This particular plane stayed in my mind vividly. To my surprise, I found out that the F-4U pilot happened to be the well-known Marine, Major Gregory Pappy Borington, who commanded the famous Black Sheep Squadron. An enemy torpedo boat had been observing us constantly from the nearby island. It became an obstacle to our air operations. On March 9, 1945, we were ordered to destroy this boat. After flying 30 minutes, we approached the target, but were unable to get in close because of the clouds. As I was making a right turn, I spotted a small destroyer going at full speed under the clouds. We dove, aiming at the bow of the ship about 6,000 meters, and dropped a bomb about 1,500 meters, while firing my machine guns. The ship began to return fire back at me. Suddenly, I felt a fierce shock. I was hit in the wing by at least 20 shots and about 10 in the fuselage. The right wing caught fire. I thought, am I done for at last? But now, the smoke had turned into flames. Many thoughts flashed through my mind. Although my life had lasted less than 20 years, it was a full life. Or was it? I came to a haze and could not breathe. Where am I? What am I doing here? Gradually, my senses began to return. I felt my thigh. It was all torn up and flabby and burned with pain when I touched it. I moved my body to check for further injuries. My back hurt, and I was wounded on my right side. I was in a hopeless condition. I don't remember how long it took me to realize my fate. As thoughts flashed through my mind, my body's condition is probably worse than I know. I can't defend myself. I found some light green seedlings, shoved them into my mouth, and munched away. Several days have passed. 5 or 6 times during this period, I saw natives carrying rifles, passing by on the jungle trails. I crawled around looking for food and places to rest. My captors carried me through rivers, ravines, and jungle. On August 20th, I was locked up in a prison camp. There were about 2,000 Japanese prisoners there who had been captured in the Pacific Theater.
In December of 1941, Mike Kawato returned to Tokyo and found to his surprise that his funeral had been held and his name removed from the family registry. The Japanese post-war government listed him as missing in action, so it was quite a surprise for everyone when Mike showed up, still nursing his 17 bullet wounds, but nonetheless very much alive. Mike Kawato shot down a total of 19 enemy aircraft during the war in the Pacific. Many years later, one of those enemies, Colonel Pappy Boyington of the famous Black Sheep Squadron, would throw his arms around Mike as they shared memories of that dogfight. Pappy said that among so-called enemy pilots, there were never any feelings of hate. Every man up there in the blue sky over the Pacific had the same job, to shoot down an enemy aircraft, not kill another pilot. Every young man who'd made it through rigorous training knew exactly how hard it was to fly a fighter in actual combat. Mike and Pappy were friends and fellow American citizens for many years until Pappy's final flight. But the memory of the Great War of the Pacific and those heroes of all nations live on. We'll see more of their exciting true experiences on our next episode of Young Pilots. See you then.